The city of Ashwood was, in most respects, unremarkable. A mid-sized urban sprawl nestled between rolling hills and a lazy river, it boasted the usual assortment of chain restaurants, struggling art galleries, and anonymous office buildings. Among these, the monolithic Zenith Corp Tower stood as one of the tallest structures, a testament to ambition cast in steel and glass. Eric, a 32-year-old night security guard, was as unremarkable as the city he inhabited. His nights at Zenith Corp were a study in monotony. He'd clock in at 6 p.m., relieved by the day's shift guard, a perpetually cheerful man named Dave who always smelled faintly of coffee and desperation. Eric would then make his rounds, a slow, deliberate patrol through the deserted floors. The fluorescent lights hummed a lonely tune, and the only sounds were the rhythmic click of his shoes on the polished linoleum and the distant drone of traffic. Eric wasn't a man of great aspirations. He'd drifted through life, taking whatever job came his way. The security gig at Zenith Corp was stable, predictable, and most importantly, solitary. He preferred it that way. He had a quiet apartment downtown, a few acquaintances he occasionally met for drinks, and a collection of old sci-fi novels that he reread compulsively. His loneliness wasn't a crushing weight, but a familiar companion. He'd grown accustomed to the quiet spaces between people, the unspoken distances that defined his relationships. Perhaps that was why the strangeness, when it began, felt so personal, so intimately tied to his own sense of isolation. He was, after all, alone when it started, bathed in the cold, unwavering light of the security monitors, completely unaware that the shadows around him were about to develop a will of their own. The routine was about to break. The hum of the fluorescent lights would soon be joined by a chorus of whispers, and the click of his shoes would be drowned out by the echoes of a nightmare taking shape. The flicker was almost imperceptible, a momentary distortion at the periphery of his vision. Eric had just finished his hourly check of the executive suites on the 30th floor. He paused by the large, tinted window overlooking the city, the sprawling grid of lights stretching out beneath him like a fallen constellation. He stretched, the muscles in his back protesting the hours of sedentary patrolling. As he did, he noticed it. His shadow, cast by the hallway's dim fluorescent tubes, lagged a fraction of a second behind his movement. He frowned, attributing it to fatigue. His sleep schedule was erratic, often punctuated by vivid, unsettling dreams. He shook his head, trying to clear the mental fog. The shadow resumed its mirroring, seemingly normal again. He chuckled softly, dismissing it as a trick of the light, a momentary lapse in perception. Getting jumpy, Eric, he muttered to himself. He continued his rounds, but the unease lingered. He found himself glancing at his shadow more frequently, checking its synchronization with his movements. He stopped abruptly in the middle of the hallway, turning his head sharply. The shadow mirrored the movement, but there was a subtle hesitation, a barely noticeable delay. Then came the emotion. He was examining a fire extinguisher when he saw it, a flicker of something akin to anger, a dark ripple across the shadow's features. Eric felt a chill crawl down his spine. He wasn't angry. He was simply checking the equipment. He stepped back, his heart beginning to pound against his ribs. He moved to another part of the hallway, watching the shadow intently. He tried to project different emotions, happiness, sadness, boredom. But the shadow remained impassive, its movements precise but devoid of feeling. Except for that unsettling undercurrent of something else. He tried a smile, a genuine attempt to reassure himself that he was imagining things. The shadow didn't smile back. Instead, it seemed to deepen, to become more solid, more defined. A sense of dread washed over him, a primal fear that resonated deep within his bones. This was no trick of the light. This was something else entirely. The jarring blare of the emergency broadcast system shattered the tense silence. The message, a digitized voice laced with urgency, crackled through the building's intercom. Attention all citizens. A state of emergency has been declared. Multiple reports are being received of unusual shadow activity. Citizens are advised to remain indoors, avoid direct sunlight, and report any anomalous occurrences to the authorities. Eric froze, his blood turning to ice water. The words confirmed his worst fears. He wasn't hallucinating. He wasn't losing his mind. Something was genuinely wrong, and it was happening citywide. He stumbled back to the security desk, the radio tuned to the emergency broadcast channel. Reports flooded in, panicked calls, eyewitness accounts of shadows moving independently, attacking people, even, playing point. One report described a shadow mimicking a child skipping motion, detaching from its host and leading a group of bewildered pedestrians on a chase through a park. Another detailed a shadow violently assaulting its owner, leaving them bruised and terrified. The details were fragmented, chaotic. But a clear picture emerged. The shadows were no longer bound by the laws of nature. No longer mere reflections of their hosts. They were alive, autonomous, and unpredictable. He glanced down at his own shadow, now stretched long and distorted by the flickering fluorescent lights. It seemed to pulsate with a dark energy, a silent malevolence that sent shivers down his spine. It mimicked his movements, but with a mocking exaggeration, a grotesque parody of his own actions. He raised his hand, and the shadow raised its own, the fingers elongated and claw-like. He felt a surge of anger, a desperate need to regain control. The shadow mirrored his anger, its form contorting into a snarling, monstrous shape. Suddenly, a new report cut through the chaos. Reports of shadows mimicking emotions, displaying behavior inconsistent with their hosts. Extreme caution advised, do not engage. Eric felt a cold dread grip his heart. The shadow was mimicking his emotions. It was learning. It was becoming something more than just a shadow. It was becoming him. The Zenith Corp tower went into lockdown automatically. Heavy steel shutters slammed down over the windows, plunging the interior into a dim, artificial twilight. The doors sealed shut with a heavy thud, cutting Eric off from the outside world. He was alone, trapped in a high-rise fortress with a sentient shadow. The lockdown, intended to protect, now felt like a prison sentence. He tried to contact Dave, the day shift guard, but the phone lines were dead. The emergency broadcast continued to cycle, repeating the same dire warnings, offering no comfort or solutions. The silence between the broadcasts was almost worse, filled only with the hum of the building's ventilation system and the unsettling rustling of his own shadow. The sheer size of the building, normally a symbol of corporate power, now amplified his isolation. 30 floors of empty offices, deserted hallways, and echoing stairwells stretched out above and below him, a vast, empty labyrinth where the shadows could roam freely. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the lights, sent a jolt of paranoia through him. He found himself constantly checking his surroundings, his eyes darting from corner to corner, searching for any sign of movement. He began to document the shadow's behavior, meticulously recording its movements, its emotional displays, its subtle deviations from his own actions. He used the security cameras to monitor its activity, rewinding the footage, analyzing every frame. The more he watched, the more convinced he became that the shadow was not merely mimicking him. It was studying him, learning his habits, anticipating his moves. He started talking to himself, narrating his actions, trying to assert some control over the situation. "Okay, Eric, just going to check the generator room," he'd say, his voice echoing in the empty hallway. "Making sure everything's running smoothly." He knew it was a futile exercise, but it helped to stave off the encroaching madness, to maintain some semblance of normalcy in the face of the impossible. He was alone, utterly alone, with a growing sense that his own shadow was becoming his enemy. The walls of the high-rise were closing in. The security camera footage became his obsession. He'd spend hours poring over the grainy black and white images, searching for any clue, any explanation for the shadow's increasingly bizarre behavior. He noticed patterns, subtle shifts in its posture, its gait, its very form. It was learning to move independently, to anticipate his actions. Then he saw it, the impossible. On camera 27, located in the lobby, he saw his shadow standing by the main entrance, a full 5 minutes before he himself arrived there on his hourly patrol. The shadow was simply standing there, motionless, but undeniably present. He checked the timestamps, rewound the footage, zoomed in on the image. There was no mistake. The shadow was in the lobby, waiting for him. The implication sent a wave of nausea through him. The shadow wasn't just mimicking him. It was stalking him. It was appearing in places he hadn't been, anticipating his movements, setting traps. He felt a chilling violation, As if his own body was being used against him. He started altering his routine, taking different routes, varying his patrol times, trying to outsmart the shadow, but it was always one step ahead. He'd find it waiting for him in unexpected locations, its dark form a silent, menacing presence. He even tried staying in one place, refusing to move, hoping to disrupt its ability to predict his actions. But the shadow simply remained still, a dark, unblinking observer, radiating an unsettling patience. He began to question his own sanity. Was he really seeing what he thought he was seeing? Was the isolation and the stress driving him mad? He looked in the mirror, searching for some sign of his own. Unraveling, he saw only a tired, haunted face, staring back at him with a growing sense of dread. He was losing control, not just of his shadow, but of his own mind. He was trapped in a nightmare, and there was no escape. The lights flickered, dimmed, and died. The city plunged into darkness. The emergency generator sputtered for a moment, then kicked in, restoring power to the essential systems, the security cameras, the emergency lights, the intercom. But the overall effect was even more unsettling. The dim, red emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows, turning the familiar hallways into a nightmarish landscape. The power outage amplified the shadow's power. With the primary lights gone, it seemed to detach further from Eric, becoming more solid, more defined. It moved with a newfound confidence, gliding across the floor, stretching and contorting in ways that defied the laws of physics. The building, once a source of paranoia, now became a hunting ground. The emergency lights revealed hidden corners, dark recesses, and unexplored spaces. The stairwells became bottomless pits, the elevator shafts gaping maws, the ventilation ducts a network of secret passages. Every shadow held a potential threat, every reflection a distorted image of his own fear. The architecture of the building, once a symbol of order and control, now served only to disorient and confuse him. He tried to navigate by the emergency lights, but the shadows danced around him, obscuring his vision, leading him down blind alleys, trapping him in dead ends. He could feel the shadow's presence, always just out of sight, a silent predator stalking its prey. He heard whispers in the darkness, faint, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to emanate from the shadows themselves. He grabbed a flashlight from the security desk, its beam cutting through the darkness, revealing the grotesque details of his surroundings. The walls seemed to breathe, the floors to shift, the shadows to writhe with a life of their own. He was lost, alone, and hunted. The building was no longer a place of work. It was a labyrinth of fear, designed to trap him, to drive him mad, to deliver him to the darkness. He rounded a corner on the 15th floor, the flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. That's when he saw it, another shadow. But this one was different. It wasn't attached to a person. It was a free-floating entity, a swirling mass of darkness that pulsed with an inner light. It writhed and contorted, its form shifting between vaguely humanoid and something utterly alien. It hung suspended in the air, blocking his path, a silent guardian of the darkness. Eric hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew, instinctively, that this wasn't just another manifestation of his own fear. This was something else, something born of the same chaos that had unleashed his own shadow, but far more powerful, far more dangerous. He tried to back away, but the shadow moved with him, gliding effortlessly through the air, its form growing larger, more menacing. He shone the flashlight directly at it, but the beam seemed to be absorbed by the darkness, swallowed whole without illuminating its form. It was as if the shadow was feeding on the light, growing stronger with each passing moment. Suddenly, the shadow lunged. It moved with incredible speed, a blur of darkness that slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. He gasped for air, his body racked with pain. He felt a cold, clammy touch on his skin, as if the shadow was trying to seep into him, to merge with his very being. He scrambled to his feet, kicking and flailing, desperate to escape the shadow's grasp. He managed to break free, stumbling backwards, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the hallway. The shadow hovered in the air, its form contorting into a mocking imitation of his own fear. He could feel its malevolence, its hunger, its desire to consume him. This was no longer just a psychological torment. It was a physical threat, a battle for survival against an entity from another world. Barely catching his breath, Eric stumbled back to the security office, his mind racing. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was happening, how these shadows were gaining sentience, how they were able to exist independently. He knew the emergency generator wouldn't last forever. Ignoring the gnawing fear, he decided to risk using one of the computers. He powered up the main terminal, praying that the internet connection was still active. After a tense few minutes, the screen flickered to life, displaying the familiar Windows interface. He navigated to a news website, his fingers trembling as he typed in search terms. Ashwood Shadow Anomaly, Independent Shadows, Quantum Experiment. The results were sparse, censored, but he found fragmented articles hinting at a failed quantum experiment at a nearby research lab, the Crestwood Institute. The articles spoke of a dimensional rift, a tear in the fabric of reality, opened during the experiment. The scientists, desperate to contain the damage, had sealed off the lab, but the effects were already spreading, manifesting as the shadow anomalies plaguing the city. One article, seemingly written by a whistleblower, mentioned the experiment's goal: to tap into alternate dimensions, to harness the energy of other realities. It spoke of the potential dangers of such an undertaking, the risk of unleashing forces beyond human comprehension. It warned of the consequences of tampering with the fundamental laws of the universe. Eric felt a cold dread wash over him. The shadows weren't just random anomalies. They were a symptom of a deeper, more terrifying problem. They were a consequence of human hubris, a price for meddling with forces that should have been left undisturbed. He stared at the screen, his mind reeling, realizing that he was trapped in the middle of a cosmic horror, a battle against forces he couldn't even comprehend. He knew then that survival meant understanding the rift, even if it meant facing the darkness head-on. He shut down the computer, the glow of the screen fading, plunging him back into the oppressive darkness. He knew he couldn't stay in the security office. The information he gleaned was a starting point, but he needed to understand the extent of the shadow activity within the building itself. He needed to see how many of these detached entities were roaming the halls. As he ventured back into the darkness, he noticed something new. The shadows weren't just moving independently. They were multiplying. In the long corridors, he saw groups of shadows huddled together, their forms merging and separating, creating new entities, smaller shadows that darted and flickered like insects. The air crackled with an unseen energy, a sense of growing chaos. He moved cautiously, his flashlight beam sweeping across the floor, illuminating the grotesque dance of the shadows. He realized that the emergency lights, intended to provide safety, were actually fueling the shadows, giving them the energy they needed to multiply. He considered shutting off the generator, plunging the building into complete darkness. But the thought of being completely blind, at the mercy of the shadows, was even more terrifying. He found himself in the main lobby, the vast open space now transformed into a swirling vortex of darkness. Shadows danced across the marble floor, their forms contorting into grotesque shapes. He saw shadows mimicking human figures, their movements jerky and unnatural. He saw shadows that resembled animals, their forms predatory and menacing. He saw shadows that were simply abstract shapes, swirling masses of darkness that defied any logical explanation. The sheer number of shadows was overwhelming. They were everywhere, multiplying at an exponential rate, turning the building into a breeding ground for darkness. He was no longer just fighting his own shadow. He was fighting an entire army of shadows, a horde of entities from another dimension, unleashed upon the world by human arrogance. He knew then that the situation was far worse than he had imagined. The building was lost. The city was lost. And he was trapped in the middle of it all, facing a darkness that threatened to consume him entirely. The whispers started subtly, a faint susurrus at the edge of his hearing, like the rustling of leaves in a distant forest. At first, he dismissed them as the product of his overactive imagination, the auditory hallucinations of sleep deprivation and fear. But the whispers grew louder, more distinct, coalescing into fragmented phrases, distorted voices, and alien languages. He realized that the whispers were coming from the shadows. They were communicating, not just with each other, but with him. The shadows were no longer just individual entities. They were a collective, a hive mind, sharing thoughts, memories, and intentions. He could feel their presence, a vast, amorphous consciousness that surrounded him, probing his mind, seeking to understand him. The shadows began to move in unison, their forms swaying and undulating in a synchronized dance of darkness. They formed patterns on the walls, geometric shapes that shifted and changed with hypnotic rhythm. He felt a strange compulsion to follow their movements, to surrender to their will, to become a part of their collective. The whispers grew more insistent, more personal. He heard his name spoken in distorted voices, followed by fragmented memories from his past, moments of joy, moments of shame, moments of regret. The shadows were dredging up his deepest secrets, exposing his vulnerabilities. Preying on his fears. He tried to block out the whispers, to shut down his mind, but it was no use. The shadows were inside his head, reading his thoughts, manipulating his emotions. He felt his identity dissolving, his sense of self blurring. As he became increasingly connected to the shadow collective. He looked down at his own shadow, which was now moving independently, its form contorting into grotesque shapes, its movements mirroring the collective dance of the other shadows. He realized that he was losing himself, that he was becoming one of them. The darkness was consuming him, body and soul, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He stumbled through the darkened hallways, the whispers swirling around him like a suffocating fog. The fragmented phrases he'd heard before now coalesced into coherent sentences, spoken in a multitude of voices, some familiar, some alien, all distorted and unsettling. He heard whispers of the experiment at the Crestwood Institute, details that weren't in the news articles, the scientists' desperation, their growing madness, their forbidden experiments with consciousness itself. He heard whispers of other dimensions, of realities beyond human comprehension, of entities that dwelled in the darkness between worlds. The shadows were sharing secrets from another world, revealing the true nature of the dimensional rift. It wasn't just a tear in the fabric of reality. It was a doorway to a realm of pure consciousness, a place where thoughts and emotions took physical form. The shadows were fragments of that realm, manifestations of repressed desires, hidden fears, and forgotten memories. He heard whispers of his own past, memories he had long suppressed, the death of his brother, the guilt he carried, the loneliness that had consumed him for years. The shadows were using his own past against him, preying on his vulnerabilities, seeking to break him down. The whispers grew more intense, more personal. He heard his brother's voice, distorted and ethereal, calling his name. "Eric, why didn't you save me?" The voice echoed in his mind, filling him with a crushing weight of guilt. He tried to block it out, to deny the truth, but the shadows wouldn't let him. They were forcing him to confront his past, to relive his darkest memories, to face the consequences of his actions. He realized that the shadows weren't just external entities. They were also a reflection of his own inner darkness. They were manifestations of his repressed emotions, his hidden desires, his deepest fears. He was fighting not just against the shadows of another world, but against the shadows within himself. The cosmic horror had become deeply personal, a battle for his own soul. He stood frozen in the lobby, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a physical burden. The whispers swirled around him, intensifying the torment, amplifying the echoes of his brother's distorted voice. And then, it happened. His own shadow, the one that had been mimicking him, stalking him, tormenting him, spoke. "Eric," the voice said, soft and raspy, but undeniably familiar. It was his brother, Michael. Eric recoiled in horror, stumbling backwards, his flashlight beam shaking wildly. "No, it can't be! Michael?" The shadow stretched and contorted, its form shifting, becoming more human, more like the image of his brother that he carried in his memory. The voice grew stronger, more distinct, resonating with the same warmth and humor that Eric remembered so vividly. "It's me, Eric," the shadow said. "I've been waiting for you." A flood of repressed grief and guilt washed over Eric, overwhelming him with a force that nearly knocked him to his knees. Michael had died 10 years ago in a car accident, a tragedy that Eric had blamed himself for ever since he had been driving that night, and although he wasn't at fault, he carried the burden of survivor's guilt, the knowledge that he had lived while his brother had died. "Michael, how is this possible?" Eric stammered, his voice choked with emotion. The rift, Eric, the shadow explained. It's brought us closer. I'm a part of you, now. A part of the shadows. The shadow stepped closer, its form reaching out to him, a dark parody of a brotherly embrace. Eric felt a pull, a compulsion to surrender to the darkness, to reunite with his brother, to finally escape the guilt that had haunted him for so long. But a part of him, a small, flickering spark of hope, resisted. He knew that this wasn't truly his brother, but a distorted echo, a manipulative entity using his grief against him. The battle for his soul had reached its climax. You always blamed yourself, didn't you, Eric? The Shadow Michael said, its voice dripping with annoying sadness. You think you could have saved me. You think it was your fault. The words were like a knife twisting in his gut. It was true. He had always blamed himself. He replayed the accident in his mind. The slick road, the oncoming headlights, the sickening crunch of metal. He had walked away with minor injuries. Michael hadn't. But it wasn't your fault, Eric. The shadow continued, its voice becoming more soothing, more persuasive. It was an accident. You need to forgive yourself. Let go of the guilt. The words were exactly what he wanted to hear, what he had longed to hear for 10 long years. But something felt wrong. The Shadow Michael was too perfect, too understanding. It was preying on his deepest desires, manipulating him with carefully chosen words. Remember that girl, Eric? The shadow whispered, its voice taking on a darker tone. Sarah? You never told anyone about what happened that night, did you? You just let her take the blame. Eric recoiled, his face flushing with shame. Sarah was his high school girlfriend. They had been caught shoplifting, but Eric had convinced her to take the fall, promising to make it up to her. He never did. You're a coward, Eric, the shadow hissed. You always have been. You hide from your problems, you run from your responsibilities. You're not worthy of being alive. The accusations hit him hard, confirming his worst fears about himself. He had always doubted his own worth, his own ability to succeed. The shadow was exploiting his insecurities, tearing down his defenses, pushing him to the brink of a psychological breakdown. He could no longer distinguish between reality and hallucination. Was the Shadow Michael truly his brother? Or was it just a manifestation of his own guilt and self-loathing? Was he truly responsible for Michael's death? For Sarah's downfall? He felt his mind unraveling, his grip on reality slipping away. He was lost in a labyrinth of his own making, a prisoner of his own past. Enough. He had been manipulated, tormented, and pushed to the brink of madness. But something inside him, a spark of defiance, refused to be extinguished. He would not surrender to the darkness. He would fight back. You're not Michael, Eric said, his voice trembling but firm. You're just a shadow, a twisted reflection of my own guilt. You're not real. The Shadow Michael laughed, a hollow, chilling sound that echoed through the lobby. Don't be ridiculous, Eric. I'm right here. I'm a part of you. We can be together again, just like old times. No! Eric shouted, his voice filled with newfound resolve. I won't let you control me. I won't let you use my past against me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an emergency flare, the kind used for signaling for help. He snapped it in half, igniting the chemical compound with a burst of blinding light and searing heat. The sudden illumination banished the shadows from the immediate area, momentarily disrupting their collective consciousness. The Shadow Michael recoiled, his form flickering and distorting in the light. What are you doing, Eric? You're hurting me. Good, Eric said, his voice filled with grim satisfaction. You deserve it. He grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall, wielding it like a club. He knew it was a crude weapon, but it was all he had. He charged at the Shadow Michael, determined to destroy it, to banish it from his life forever. The shadow lunged at him, its form contorting into a monstrous shape, its eyes glowing with malevolent intent. The battle had begun. It was a physical and psychological struggle. A fight for his own sanity, a desperate attempt to reclaim his identity from the darkness that threatened to consume him. He would not go down without a fight. The fight was chaotic and brutal. Eric swung the fire extinguisher with all his might, connecting with the Shadow Michael's form, sending it reeling. But the shadow was resilient, its form constantly shifting and reforming, its movements unpredictable and unsettling. As they battled, Eric's mind raced. Trying to make sense of the information he had gleaned from the whispers and the shadows' distorted memories. He began to understand the true nature of the dimensional rift, not just as a tear in reality, but as a gateway to the collective unconscious, a realm of pure thought and emotion. The shadows weren't just random entities. They were manifestations of the repressed emotions and alternate realities that existed within the human subconscious. They were born of fear, guilt, desire, and regret, given form and substance by the energy of the rift. He realized that the experiment at the Crestwood Institute had not just opened a doorway to another dimension. It had tapped into the deepest recesses of the human mind, unleashing the monsters that lurked within. The shadows were a reflection of humanity's collective darkness, a physical embodiment of its deepest fears, and his own shadow, the one that bore the face of his dead brother, was a manifestation of his own guilt, his own self-loathing, his own repressed grief. It was a twisted reflection of his inner turmoil, given life and sentience by the power of the rift. The Shadow Michael spoke again, its voice a mix of anger and desperation. "You can't defeat me, Eric. I'm a part of you. You can't escape your own guilt." "I know," Eric said, his voice filled with newfound understanding. "But I can control it. I can face it. I can accept it." He knew that he couldn't destroy the shadow completely, not without destroying a part of himself. But he could learn to live with it, to accept his past, to forgive himself for his mistakes. He could harness the energy of the rift, not to unleash the darkness, but to confront it, to heal it, to find peace. The fight continued, but Eric's focus had shifted. He was no longer trying to destroy the Shadow Michael. He was trying to understand it, to communicate with it, to find a way to heal the rift that had created it. As he fought, he realized that the only way to truly stop the shadows, to prevent them from consuming the world, was to close the dimensional rift. And the only way to close the rift was to confront the source of the darkness, to embrace his past, to forgive himself for his mistakes. He knew that closing the rift would be dangerous, potentially fatal. The energy of the other dimension was volatile and unpredictable. It could tear him apart, consume him entirely. But he also knew that he had no choice. He couldn't let the shadows continue to spread, to corrupt the world, to destroy everything he cared about. He looked at the Shadow Michael, its form flickering and distorting in the dim light. He saw not just a monster, but a reflection of his own pain, his own suffering. He saw his brother, trapped in a realm of darkness, yearning for peace. "I'm sorry, Michael," Eric said, his voice filled with genuine remorse. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I carried this guilt for so long." The Shadow Michael's form softened, its anger subsiding, replaced by a flicker of something akin to sadness. "It's okay, Eric," the Shadow said, its voice almost a whisper. "It's time to let go." Eric knew what he had to do. He had to find a way to channel the energy of the rift, to use it to close the doorway between worlds. He had to climb to the top of the Zenith Corp Tower, to the emergency generator, and overload the system, creating a surge of energy that would disrupt the dimensional field. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. But it was the only chance he had. He had to embrace his destiny, to confront his inner demons, to sacrifice himself for the greater good. He was ready to face the darkness, to fight for the light. The climb to the roof was arduous, a vertical ascent through the darkened stairwells, each step a test of his resolve. The shadows seemed to sense his purpose, their whispers growing louder, more frantic, trying to deter him from his mission. He ignored them, focusing on the task at hand, driven by a newfound sense of purpose. He finally reached the roof, the wind whipping around him, carrying the scent of rain and the distant sounds of the city. The emergency generator loomed before him, a hulking metal beast humming with barely contained power. The sky above was a swirling vortex of darkness, mirroring the chaos that had engulfed the city, and there, standing before the generator, was his shadow. The Shadow Michael, its form more solid, more menacing than ever before. It stood between him and his goal, a final obstacle to overcome. "You can't do this, Eric," the Shadow said, its voice filled with a desperate plea. "You'll destroy us both. We're connected, remember? If you close the rift, I'll cease to exist." "I know," Eric said, his voice calm and resolute. But it's the only way. I can't let the shadows continue to spread. I have to stop them, even if it means sacrificing myself. But what about me? The shadow pleaded. Don't you care about me? I'm your brother. You're not my brother, Eric said, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. You're just a shadow, a reflection of my own pain. And my brother is gone, and it's time for me to let him go. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he had to do. He knew that this was the end. One way or another. He was either going to close the rift and save the world, or he was going to be consumed by the darkness. But he was no longer afraid. He had faced his demons, he had accepted his past, and he was ready to embrace his destiny. Eric reached for the generator's control panel, his hand trembling slightly. He knew that one wrong move could be fatal. The shadow Michael watched him, its form shifting and swirling, its emotions unreadable. Goodbye, Michael, Eric whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and love. He slammed his hand down on the overload switch. The generator sputtered, groaned, and then unleashed a torrent of energy, a blinding surge of light that ripped through the darkness. The air crackled with electricity, the ground vibrated beneath his feet. The shadow Michael screamed, its form dissolving into a cloud of darkness. The sky above seemed to tear open, revealing glimpses of other dimensions, alternate realities, swirling vortexes of pure energy. The Zenith Corp tower shook violently, threatening to collapse. Then everything went silent. The light faded, the vibrations ceased, and the darkness returned. Eric stood on the roof, panting, his body racked with exhaustion. The shadow Michael was gone. But what had happened? Had he succeeded in closing the rift? Had he saved the city? Or had he simply unleashed something even more terrible? He looked around, searching for answers. The city below was still, shrouded in darkness, but the shadows seemed less menacing, less organized. The whispers had subsided, replaced by an eerie silence. He looked down at his own feet. There was no shadow. Had he destroyed it? Had he destroyed himself? Or had he somehow merged with it, becoming something more, something new? The answer remained elusive. The ending was ambiguous, open to interpretation. Had Eric saved the world? Or had he simply succumbed to the darkness? Had he found peace? Or had he lost himself completely? The true nature of reality remained shrouded in shadow, leaving the audience to question what they had just witnessed, to ponder the true meaning of the darkness within. Perhaps the shadows never truly leave us. They merely become a part of who we are.